Podcast Talk.
Learn English naturally.
How real people actually chat in English.
Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that when you finally understand English in real life, it sounds nothing like what you learned in school? People don't finish sentences. They pause, restart, change direction mid-thought, and yet somehow everything makes sense. That gap between correct English and real conversations confuses a lot of learners because no one teaches you how people actually chat when they're relaxed, distracted, or just being themselves. Today, we're talking about that real, imperfect, everyday English.
Yes, and that confusion often makes people think they're bad at English. They understand textbooks, but real conversations feel chaotic. People jump topics, use simple words, react emotionally. There's grammar missing, sentences are incomplete, and yet communication works. Real chat isn't about sounding impressive. It's about staying connected in the moment. And that's a skill most learners never practice.
I remember very clearly when this clicked for me. I was listening to two native speakers talk, and at first I thought I was missing something. Their sentences were unfinished, ideas overlapped, and sometimes they changed direction halfway through a thought. But the strange thing was, I understood everything. Not because the language was perfect, but because the rhythm felt natural. They were reacting to each other, not performing English. And that's when I realized something important. Real conversations aren't built to sound correct. They're built to keep the connection alive. Once I stopped listening for grammar and started listening for intention, English suddenly made a lot more sense.
I think that's exactly what surprises most learners. They expect real English to be more complex, more advanced, more impressive. But in reality, it's often simpler and less structured. People rely on shared context, tone, and timing instead of full sentences. They interrupt each other, agree halfway through a thought, or respond before an idea is finished. And none of that feels rude or confusing. It feels natural. Because the goal isn't to deliver a perfect sentence, it's to stay in sync with the other person.
And that's where many learners feel blocked. They wait until they know exactly what to say. They build sentences carefully in their head, word by word. But real conversations don't wait. They move forward even when ideas are unfinished. I've seen people with very strong grammar struggle in casual chats simply because they were trying to be correct instead of responsive. Real chatting is less about accuracy and more about timing.
One big difference is how natives handle uncertainty. They're comfortable sounding unsure. They say things like, I mean, kind of, or just pause and restart. Those moments aren't mistakes. They're signals that someone is thinking in real time. And listeners expect that. When learners try to remove all uncertainty, their speech often sounds stiff and rehearsed.
I think that's why real English can feel uncomfortable at first. It asks you to speak before you're fully ready, to trust that the other person will meet you halfway. In textbooks, everything is complete. In real life, almost nothing is. And learning to chat means learning to be okay with that messiness.
And that messiness is actually what makes conversations human. When people hesitate, correct themselves, or laugh mid-sentence, it creates warmth. It signals authenticity. Perfectly structured speech can sound distant in casual settings. Real chat invites participation. It leaves space for the other person to jump in.
This is why listening matters so much. Not listening for vocabulary lists, but for patterns. How people start sentences, how often they don't finish them, the little sounds, reactions, and pauses. When you train your ear this way, speaking becomes less scary. You stop trying to perform English and start using it.
And once that shift happens, confidence grows naturally. Not because your English suddenly becomes perfect, but because communication starts working. You feel understood. You see reactions. That feedback loop is what builds real fluency. Not rules memorized in isolation, but moments of connection repeated over time.
One thing learners rarely notice is how emotional real conversations are. People don't just exchange information, they react constantly. They show agreement, confusion, surprise, hesitation. And those reactions often matter more than the actual words. I've listened to so many real chats where half the meaning lived in tone, timing, and small sounds. Little responses like yay, toi, right, or oh, I see, keep the conversation alive. Without them, speech feels empty, even if the grammar is perfect. Real chatting is emotional first, linguistic second.
That's such an important point. Many learners focus on speaking, but real conversations depend just as much on how you listen. Active listening is what makes chatting feel smooth. When you react in small ways, the other person feels heard. And once someone feels heard, they naturally speak more clearly. That's why real English flows even when sentences are broken. The conversation carries itself forward through mutual attention, not perfect structure.
I've noticed that when learners stop trying to sound impressive, something changes. Their English becomes simpler but more natural. They stop searching for advanced vocabulary and start responding honestly. And that honesty creates trust. Real people don't expect you to sound perfect, they expect you to sound present. Once that pressure lifts, conversations stop feeling like tests and start feeling like interactions.
And this is where many traditional learning methods fail. They train people to produce language, but not to participate in conversations. Participation means reacting, adjusting, and sometimes saying very little. Silence, pauses, and short responses are part of real English. When learners accept that, their speech relaxes. And relaxed speech always sounds more natural than controlled speech.
This is why exposure matters more than perfection. The more real conversations you hear, the more your brain adjusts. You start sensing what sounds normal even before you can explain it. That intuition is what guides real chatting. And once you trust it, English stops feeling foreign, it starts feeling usable.
One thing I had to unlearn was the idea that speaking less means speaking badly. In real conversations, people often say very little, but they stay fully engaged. They nod, react, interrupt gently, or just say yeah at the right moment. And that small participation carries a lot of meaning. I used to think I had to fill every silence with words, but native speakers don't rush to fill gaps. They let moments breathe. That comfort with silence is something learners rarely practice, but it's a huge part of sounding natural.
Yes, and that fear of silence usually comes from learning English in artificial settings. In classrooms, silence often means you don't know the answer. But in real life, silence can mean you're listening, thinking, or simply present. I've noticed that when learners allow short pauses, their speech becomes calmer. They stop rushing to prove something, and the other person feels more comfortable too. Real chat isn't about speed, it's about shared rhythm.
That shared rhythm is what makes conversations feel easy. You can feel when it's okay to jump in and when it's better to wait. Native speakers sense this intuitively, but learners often ignore it. They focus on grammar instead of flow. And when flow is missing, even correct English can sound tense. Once you start paying attention to rhythm, something shifts. You stop translating in your head and start responding in real time.
I think another thing learners don't expect is how forgiving real conversations actually are. People are not listening with a red pen in their head. They're listening for intention, emotion, and direction. If they understand what you're trying to say, they almost automatically ignore small mistakes. I've had conversations where my grammar wasn't perfect at all, but the connection was strong. And I've also seen people with advanced English struggle to connect because they were too focused on sounding correct. Real people don't measure your English by accuracy, they measure it by how easy it feels to talk to you. And ease comes from being present, not precise.
Yes, and that idea alone can change how people approach speaking. Once you stop seeing conversations as performance, your body relaxes, your voice softens, your reactions become more natural, and you stop monitoring every sentence. That self-monitoring is incredibly tiring. It pulls your attention away from the other person and back onto yourself. But real chatting isn't about self-control. It's about shared attention. When you focus on the person instead of your English, communication starts working almost automatically, and that's usually the moment learners realize they were capable all along.
I think one of the biggest surprises for learners is realizing that real conversations are rarely efficient. Oh, people don't talk to exchange information as quickly as possible. They talk to feel connected, understood, and less alone. That's why real chat includes repetition, small comments, emotional reactions, and sometimes long pauses. I've had conversations where we said almost nothing new, but the connection still felt strong. Learners often rush because they think time equals progress. But in real English, slowing down often creates deeper communication. When you allow the conversation to breathe, people relax. And that's when English starts sounding natural instead of forced.
I think another thing that surprises learners is how indirect real chat often is. People rarely say exactly what they mean in one clean sentence. They hint, soften, hesitate, or circle around the point. This isn't confusion, it's social awareness. In real conversations, being too direct can feel uncomfortable or even rude. So people adjust their language to protect the connection. Learners often think indirect speech is unclear, but for native speakers, it's actually respectful. Once you understand that, a lot of strange English suddenly makes sense.
Yes, and this is where textbooks usually fail learners. They teach clear questions and clear answers, but real chat rarely works that way. People avoid giving firm answers because life itself is uncertain. Instead of saying yes or no, they say things like maybe, we'll see, or it depends. These phrases don't mean nothing, they mean flexibility. I've noticed that once learners accept this softness, like they stop feeling confused. Um, they realize English isn't vague, like it's adaptable.
And that adaptability shows up even in small talk. People often talk about weather, schedules, or random details, not because they matter, but because they create safety. Small talk gives both sides time to read the mood. Learners sometimes dismiss it as useless, but it's actually functional. It prepares the space for deeper conversation, or gently ends it. When you understand the role of small talk, you stop forcing depth too early. And real English starts feeling smoother and less awkward.
I think this is why real chat feels so different from scripted English. Scripts focus on meaning, but conversations focus on people. Tone, timing, and intention often carry more weight than words. When learners stop chasing perfect sentences and start paying attention to these signals, something shifts. They become easier to talk to. And once that happens, English stops being a skill you perform. It becomes something you use to stay connected.
One thing that surprises learners when they start listening to real English is how often conversations repeat the same idea in different forms. People do not repeat themselves because they are weak speakers. They repeat because repetition is how humans build understanding, comfort, and trust. In real chat, you say a thought, then you reshape it. You soften it, you clarify it, you add a small example, and you watch the other person's reaction. If they look confused, you try again with simpler words. If they nod, you keep going. This is why real English sounds less efficient than a textbook English. Textbook teach one perfect sentence. Real people build meaning together step by step with small repeats and gentle adjustments. And once learners accept repetition as normal, their English immediately starts sounding more natural, more relaxed, and more human.
I think this is the moment where many learners finally notice the difference between speaking English and actually chatting in English. When you chat, you are not delivering information, you are responding to a human being in real time. That means your reactions matter just as much as your words. A small pause, a quiet laugh, a soft, yeah, I get that, can carry more meaning than a long sentence. Real people feel these signals immediately. I've seen conversations completely change just because someone slowed down and reacted honestly. When learners allow themselves to react instead of perform, English starts feeling less like a task and more like a shared experience.
Another thing that separates real chat from learned English is how often people talk without a clear goal. In textbooks, every dialogue has a purpose. In real life, many conversations exist simply to maintain connection. People talk while walking, waiting, or doing something else, and the words are secondary. What matters is presence. Learners often feel uncomfortable when a conversation has no clear direction. They think something is wrong. But for native speakers, this kind of open, unstructured talk feels natural. It creates familiarity. When learners accept that not every conversation needs a point, English becomes less stressful and more natural to use.
Yes, and this is also where many learners feel pressure to be interesting. They think they need stories, opinions, or clever responses. But real people rarely expect that. Most everyday chats are built on small observations and shared moments. Saying something simple like, that sounds tiring, or yeah, I know that feeling, is often enough. These small responses show understanding. I've noticed that when learners stop trying to impress, conversations feel lighter. The connection grows not because of what is said, but because of how naturally it's shared.
This is why real English can feel uncomfortable at first. It doesn't follow clear rules or patterns. It requires attention, patience, and emotional awareness. But once learners stop trying to control every sentence, something changes. They start noticing rhythm, tone, and timing instead of grammar alone. Over time, this awareness replaces fear. English stops feeling like a performance, and then starts feeling like a space where you can exist comfortably with another person. That's when communication becomes real.
I think the most important shift happens when learners stop asking how to sound correct and start asking how to stay present. Real conversations are not about delivering clean sentences. They are about responding to another human being in the moment. That means sometimes you hesitate, sometimes you repeat yourself, sometimes you say very little. And all of that is normal. I've noticed that once learners accept this, their anxiety drops, they stop monitoring themselves constantly. Instead, they listen more and react more honestly. That honesty is what people feel. And when people feel it, communication becomes easier, even if the language is simple.
Yes, and this is why exposure matters more than explanation. You can read rules wherever, but they won't teach you how conversations actually feel. Real understanding comes from hearing how people talk when they're relaxed, distracted, or emotional. Over time, your brain starts recognizing patterns without effort. You stop translating and start responding. That transition is slow and quiet, but it's powerful. It's the moment when English stops living in your head and starts living in interaction. And that's something no textbook can give you.
That's why learning real English is really about learning to be comfortable in conversation, not perfect, not impressive, but present. If you're listening to this, you're already doing the right thing by exposing yourself to real dialogue. And if you want to keep developing that feeling for natural English, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what kind of conversations you want to hear next. Real English grows through real interaction, and we're glad you're here for it.